I was asked to talk about what's new in cover crops, and I said yes before I realized that that would be at the end of a conference talking about cover crops. So a little bit of pressure to come up with something new, but I think there's a few things that we can cover. To start out, can I get a show of hands of who actually plants cover crops currently? Okay, great. And then could you raise your hands again if you've planted something other than cereal rye? Okay, it seems like it's about the same crowd. And cereal rye, turnips, or radishes, if you've planted something else besides that. Okay, great. That's exciting. You'll hear people say that there's like 4 or 5% of the acres that are cover cropped. And then I ask about the diversity component because that's really what we focus on at Green Cover. Green Cover is a seed provider for cover crops and forages in south central Nebraska, about 30 minutes southwest of Hastings. And we have about 120 different cover crop options, and fitting those into a corn soybean rotation is sometimes the challenge as we're working especially with the warm season species. So short amount of time to cover some of the things that I'd like to do, but to start out with cover crops or what's new in cover crops, I think there's two main approaches that I want to cover. One of those is species, and then I'm sure that's probably what we think of when we talk about what's new. What species is coming out that's going to solve these problems. But I think practices is another thing that we really need to hit on. To start off with some of the species, I want to talk about camelina. Has anybody heard of camelina so far? Okay, maybe the same hands that went up for the cover cropping question. So camelina is a winter hardy brassica. This is one of the few things that we can plant later. Oftentimes, most of the time, I would say, we can't really say that it's better to plant this later in the season. And again, when we're talking about a corn soybean rotation, that's really what we want. And so camelina is one of the few things that might fit that window pretty well. So as we get into October, most of the time we think rye is about the only option left. A lot of the brassicas like turnips, radishes, rapeseed, they're not really going to do much. But camelina is one of those that can work pretty well in this window. You don't want this to go vertical at all going into the winter. You just want a rosette flat with a soil surface. That's how you're going to get the winter hardiness. It is important to make sure that you're looking for a winter camelina, not a spring camelina. It will not do the same things. The reasons for using camelina would be a diversity component. I mentioned rye is one of the most common ones, obviously, but if we want to get something else out there, recognizing that each root has its own root exudate that it produces, I think there's some value to consider what camelina could do. It also is going to be something that can really reduce the amount of seed that you have to put out, especially if you're doing some cost sharing. 400 to 450,000 seeds in a pound of this, and so it just can really reduce the amount of seed that's needed. It also is going to reduce the biomass that's produced. And so you think that's probably not a good thing for a cover crop. But in some situations, especially going into corn, that might be nice to have some reduced amount of biomass if you're not wanting to go through a 6-foot crop of standing rye. There's some good research being done with, I put UND, but that's actually North Dakota State and University of Minnesota. I also wanted to give a shout out to Ruth McCabe, who's over here in the red vest. I learned a lot of camelina information from her at a conference in Iowa, so ask her if you have more questions about camelina, specifically opportunities maybe around relay cropping or double cropping. The next thing I want to cover is rye, but not rye as we know it, hybrid rye. This one I'll go through pretty quickly. Look up KWS hybrid rye if you're wanting to learn more about it. They have the best information about it because they are the ones doing the genetics for it. There's something for everyone with this, whether it's for forage production, maybe taking some silage, grain production, especially either for feeding livestock or even malting. There's some niches opening up, I think, with hybrid rye. More expensive seed, lower seeding rate, but significantly higher yield potential. We're talking probably north of 100 bushel per acre, whereas regular rye might be around 50, depending where you're at. Winter peas. Somebody mentioned winter peas, I think, at one point. And this is an exciting one because we're trying to find winter hardy legumes oftentimes. I would say this is not going to be a reliable overwintering option unless your name is Paul Yassa. Paul is very good at getting this to overwinter at the Rogers Memorial Farm east of Lincoln. And he shares his secrets that we can all adopt to get these to overwinter. But a couple of the things is have a nice blanket of snow when it's -30. Since we can't control that, another option is to plant it deep, 3 to 4 inches deep. Now, Paul is an expert when it comes to drilling things deep. His focus is in mechanical engineering and soil health, and so he's been able to figure this out. I would say for the rest of us, we can look at some of those principles to help us with that, but also know that the genetics are improving in this one. We're getting some seed production on a Wyo winter pea, even in northeastern Nebraska. So I do see winter peas becoming more winter hardy in the future with a little bit more genetic focus and breeding. So let's transition to practices. We often talk about, again, like I mentioned, we have lots of different exciting cover crop species. I mean, we could talk about sun hemp, we could talk about cowpeas, we could talk about flax. We're looking at a lot of different flowers as well. So many different species, but how do we get this into a corn soybean rotation? Well, one option would be to add the small grain back. We listen to some people even here in eastern Nebraska who are adding small grains back to their rotation. And we've heard some other presentations earlier in the day about maybe why we need to look at doing that. One of the reasons that I would say is the amount of diversity that you can get in that window. We're talking about 12 to 15 way mixes easily as we get warm season and cool season species planted together to cover a whole host of benefits. Sometimes people are using this window to have a really nitrogen heavy focus, planting spring peas, winter peas, cowpeas, sun hemp, faba beans, go really heavy on the legumes. Some people might want it just for stockpiled forage, and you see that here with this herd and some of what Mary Dranowski was talking about. So it's a great option to just mix up the crop rotation, diversify for the sake of breaking some pest cycles, but also many different root types that you can get in the soil. We heard about interseeding earlier today, and I think there's some really exciting work being done on this. I won't dwell on it because we've heard some great work on it. Just know that we are also hoping to get much more of a focus on this year. As Katja explained, I run our test plots in Bladen, and this is one of the things that we're hoping to show a lot of different mixes this year. We're hoping to show some different timings, some different plantings. There's a lot of merit to figuring out this system. I don't think we're going to have the perennial focus to it this year, like with the Aberlasting clover, but red clover is a common one, and we will be showing that. So know that when people are talking about interseeding, they may mean two different things: V3, V4 interseeding when the corn is really young, or flying on aerially when the corn is starting to wilt down. Just a little bit of a note there. Now, biostrips is one of the last things I want to cover. And we've seen some other pictures that look a little bit like this, where we've got one species and then a row of another species alternating like this. We haven't discussed this particular method so far, though, today. And this is one that I think is worth mentioning it. It's probably at least 5 years old, perhaps much longer than that. But what we have here is some radishes. Those are going to be the taller broadleaves. And then we have rye in the middle there. Why I think this deserves being looked at is because the radishes are going to winter kill. They have the tuber in the ground that's really opening the ground up. We get a lot of earthworm activity around there. But since they're going to winter kill, that strip is going to be collecting a lot of moisture without using the moisture. So then you can plant the corn right down that strip. The soil is opened up a little bit, and you still have rye in between the corn rows for a little bit more residue that's going to last a little bit longer into the season and help with weed prevention. So I just wanted to mention that concept as well. And the last thing, again, is just an emphasis on management. I was at church this Sunday telling somebody what I do, and I work with cover crops, and they were quick to tell me, oh yeah, we use a little bit of cover crops, but we've kind of gotten away from it because it just doesn't work with dry spring that uses all the moisture and then kind of screws us on the corn. Well, I would say, let's think about the management that goes into this. Cereal rye that grows this tall is going to use a lot more moisture than cereal rye that grows this tall. And so I just want to emphasize that we need to be adaptive in how we manage these cover crops. We need to be using different species. We need to be looking at different ways to terminate them, and especially different timings to terminate them. So management is everything. And last thing is give things some time. Going back to the winter peas, those have significant potential for nitrogen production. We've taken some biomass samples from our test plots the last several years. This last year was week by week as the vetch, the winter peas were coming on. 2 years ago, we collected some biomass samples from our peas. It was one strip. We did not replicate this, but on May 28th, it was 240 pounds of nitrogen in that biomass. That's not going to all come available to the corn in that year, but that's a lot of nitrogen. And even if we say 80 to 100 pounds might come available, that's some significant savings on fertilizer. So I say that though, because it took until May 28th to get there. You're not going to get those benefits if you plant the corn into that legume cover crop on May 1st, for instance. It needs some time. It's amazing. We've measured the vetch again week to week, and it will literally double itself in the amount of biomass, nitrogen supply week to week as we go throughout May. So give things time when you're using some legume cover crops. So again, those are some species and some management practices that we can think about with cover crops. And I also want to mention, we do a soil health resource guide each year. I think some of you have been able to grab some of those. We do have those on the handout table here. Question in the back.
Yes. When you talk about diversity of cover crop species, is there a limit? And over the years, you see people put a cocktail of anything together, but is there a practical limit of how many species should be in some kind of cover crop cocktail?
Yeah, that's a great question. The number of species that needs to go in a mix, it all depends on the goals. So let's say, for instance, the goal might be something to roller crimp. We want a roller crimp for the termination method. In a case like that, I'm saying, let's be pretty simple with the blend. Maybe it's not even a blend, maybe it's just cereal rye. To get roller crimping to work effectively, you need things to be at a uniform stage, all reaching anthesis for it to actually crimp kill. That would be a situation where, let's keep it simple. We deal with forages too, and there's times where if somebody wants to pour some fertility to it, maybe keep it more simple. Again, in the case of after wheat, I think that's a wonderful case where we can get a lot of different species. So then the question is, so what does 12 species do for you that 8 doesn't do? I think that goes into plant density and the ratios. We figure things on a percent of a full rate basis. So for instance, rye might be 80 to, if it's going to be, let's use oats for example, 80 to 100 pounds might be the full rate of that. But then we want some rapeseed with it or some collards with it, and we want 7 or 8 pounds of that. We're going to figure things on the percent of a full rate of each of those and combining those to get to 100%. If we're using 12 different species in there, that's just so small. We're getting smaller and smaller of the percentages of each that we're going to have in there. And then it comes down to when you walk through the field, are you actually seeing those or not? There's going to be a difference if you were walking through the field versus driving by it and what you see. And so your analysis might be a little bit different in that way. But I think there's something to be said about giving the options for the soil too. There's going to be, I've seen fields that grow one thing dominantly one year and grow something completely different the next year with the same seed or seed bank even. And so giving options to let the soil kind of tell you is another approach. But yeah, I would say most mixes that I'm creating are probably 6 to 10 species.
On the camelina with rye, what would be the ratio if you're seeding 70 pounds of rye in the fall as a cover, how much camelina would you put in there?
You might do something like 35 to 40 pounds of rye and go to 2 to 3 pounds of camelina.
And you'll seed the camelina?
I would maybe defer to Ruth on that one. Small seeds you don't need as much seed to soil contact. So that's one school of thought. On the other hand, when you're getting that small, that could spread rather easily. I would say, let's keep it a little bit closer to the soil. Actually, one of the things that Ruth had in her presentation that I attended was even showing the difference when we extended the drop tubes, if I'm remembering right. And that would obviously go through maybe the small box of 2-box drill. And there was a big difference in the ones that had a short drop tube versus when they extended the drop tube closer to the press wheel, and getting much better results with longer drop tube. And so I would be hesitant to aerially broadcast it.
Can you speak to availability? Right now, I personally am waiting for some plantain. Is there a pretty good availability of everything else across the board?
Across the board, it's no, I guess would be the short answer. There's going to be a lot of things that we have got great supply of, and there's going to be things that are lesser. When we have that many different species, it's just hard to make an across the board statement. Plantain is one thing that I'm pretty excited to get back in when we're doing some pasture overseeding mixes and things like that. You're talking about separating out if they were to be a diverse mix, and we don't want to see this part of the field be all the small seeds, this part of the, okay. If we're talking about a 2 or 3 species mix, and we've got maybe winter peas and rapeseed, that's going to separate very easily because you've got some bigger spheres and you've got some very small spheres. And as that's going through some different bumps through the field, that's going to separate out pretty easily. As we add some different shapes, different sizes, different structures of seed and get it more diverse, then it's going to not separate quite as much. We use oats. Even 5 or 10 pounds is going to really help in locking that seed in place a little bit more. And sunflowers would be kind of similar. So typically 2 or 3 species, I might be a little bit more hesitant. So rye and camelina, let's keep those separate and plant them through separate boxes. But if we're talking about a 10-way mix for after wheat, I would typically plant that all together.